Bona tarda. A continuació us presentaré el moderador de la taula d'aquesta tarda, que per mi és un honor tindre una taula i ponents d'aquest nivell. En Jordi Sunyer és doctor en Medicina, és el director científic adjunt del Centre de Recerca en Epidemiologia Ambiental, el CREAL de Barcelona, i també és catedràtic de Medicina Preventiva i Salut Pública a la Universitat Pompeu Fabra. És el fundador i el coordinador del projecte IMMA, Infància i Medi Ambient, sobre els efectes de l'exposició prenatal i postnatal de contaminants en el desenvolupament neurològic, i també és l'investigador principal del projecte BRID, que estudia l'impacte de la contaminació ambiental de Barcelona sobre el desenvolupament cognitiu dels nens en etapa escolar. Les seves investigacions han tingut un gran impacte en la salut pública i a darrere seu hi ha més de 150 publicacions sobre els seus projectes. Res més, us deixo amb el doctor Sunyer.
Moltes gràcies per la invitació i sobretot per tenir la possibilitat de convidar dos companys en el món de l'epidemiologia del desenvolupament del cervell, que crec que us interessarà molt. Aleshores jo parlaré de cervell i contaminació de l'aire. Antigament, no fa pas moltes dècades, es considerava que la placenta era una barrera perfecta que protegia el fetus. De totes maneres, en aquests moments nosaltres ja sabem que, per exemple, en el cas del tabac, doncs hem trobat que hi ha marques epigenètiques en la placenta, o trobem que quan el nadó neix ja trobem cotinina, que és el metabòlit del tabac, en l'orina d'aquest nadó. Vol dir que el nadó, quan està en l'etapa prenatal, està expost al mateix que la mare, de manera que la placenta no és una barrera perfecta. Això té impactes molt profunds, com que aquest nadó en concret pesarà 250 grams menys, i evidentment això té una importància per tots els òrgans del seu organisme. En la història de la medicina estic inquiet perquè voldria... Jo, si no us sap greu, canviaria l'anglès mentre no arribi l'aparell. Okay. So, in the history of medicine, there was a crucial event that was the Minamata crisis, where there was an outbreak of cerebral palsy in the children born in a certain period in Minamata. And what did happen, it was that the mothers of the children ate fish with very, very high levels of mercury. And what we did learn was that the mothers were not affected at all, though they were the exposed. And the siblings of these children were neither affected. And they ate the same fish than the mothers. And it was the new generation that was in the womb while the mothers were exposed that have this cerebral disease, a very specific and particular form of cerebral palsy. So we started to understand that there are several windows of susceptibility, in that case for the brain development, and especially the prenatal life. So for instance, in CREAL, we have discovered last years that air pollution is producing several effects during the prenatal life, and we have found reproductive effects like a smaller fetal growth and a smaller birth weight, pulling together hundreds of children in studies with around 20,000 children that have had a big impact. So we know that air pollution is also affecting the fetal life in addition of what was known for smoking. And we have papers on fetal effects, but also on the mother life during the pregnancy. And there are a lot of mechanistic studies how the air pollution or the environmental exposures can affect the fetus. And we know that since the placenta could be, it's not perfect, well, there is some exposure directly to the children. So we found in biological samples collected in the children levels of exposure that were carried from the mothers. But in addition, we know that there is an effect on the placental function. And now we start to know that if the placenta is inflamed and there is a dysfunction of the placenta, there is an effect in the brain development and in the heart, of course. But in addition, we know that several of the mechanisms are because of a malfunction of the mother. So there is systemic low-grade inflammation, there is genetic and epigenetic impact that all together explain why the fetal life could be affected by the environment. In the fetus, the brain is the most important organ, and this is known by all of you. And what's important is that for the whole pregnancy, the brain could be sensitive to the environmental insults. And also, all of you know that the brain development lasts after birth and lasts for all childhood, even until the end of adolescence. So it's not only the prenatal life, but also the postnatal life, and in particularly the early life that is susceptible, because it's when there was the wiring and the pruning, particularly during the first 2 years of life, that is when the brain is more susceptible to these environmental insults. Air pollution could be one of the major exposures in our life. According to WHO, is the most important environmental hazard, not only in the developed world, if not all globally in the whole world. And in particularly, among the air pollutants, we are worried about the invisible pollutants, and in particularly about the particle fraction of the air. So what is in the air that are not gases. And what matters and makes toxic these particles is the size of the particles. So this represents a hair, one of our hairs, and this is the diameter of the hair. And a fifth of our hair is a PM10, so a particle of 10 microns. And this more or less is the size of an erythrocyte. And this is at the end range of the visibility. And what happened with PM10 is that these are respirable particles. But what's more worrisome are the PM2.5, that are particles of 2.5 microns. That means it's a fourth of PM10, so a 20th time of a hair that are really invisible at the size of a virus. And this PM2.5 that are in our environment and released by our cars can go deep in the lungs and reach the alveoli and produce an inflammation at the end of the lungs. And this, as the American Cardiology Association showed in this monography in 2010, that review all the literature until that time, went to this theory about how this PM2.5 can produce damage in the humans. So the door of entrance is the lungs. Then there is a response in the lungs. So this is a review of all animal studies, in vitro studies. We know what exactly happens at cellular level and at biological level. So we know all the mediators and how this inflammation has an impact in the rest of the body, particularly in the cardiovascular system. And also how these particles, if they are ultrafine, if they are lower than PM1, can enter in the body and reach organs like the heart or the vessels, and how atherosclerosis could be a consequence of particulate matter inhalation. So now there is a theory, and this was accepted by the cardiologists, that agrees that particulate matter is one of the risk factors of ischemic heart disease, for instance. So you see here that brain is in this scheme. So there is already brain. So the cardiologists tell us, yeah, brain could be affected by particulate matter. But the theory behind is that this is because the vascular effects. And in fact, if we go to the review of 2014 by WHO, we saw that the impact of particulate matter in health is basically through cardiovascular events. So 40% of the impact is through a stroke, and 40% is through ischemic heart disease, and only 1/3 is because of respiratory effects, and some are the lung cancer. So today, our vision of the effects of air pollution is that are mostly through cardiovascular effects. But the brain is already affected because of the vascular effects. Well, this history is changing, in part thanks to these pathologies. This is a movement in Mexico that started to talk about Alzheimer and Parkinson in children. So that Alzheimer and Parkinson start in childhood, and that lesions, that pathological lesions that are seen in Alzheimer patients could be seen in children. So she arrives to this conclusion after studying dogs in Mexico City from a highly polluted area and compared these dogs with dogs from clean areas. And she found when they get the brains and put the brains under the micro, she found lesions similar to Alzheimer in the brains, and started to talk about neuroinflammation and another pathway, how particles can produce brain effects, that it's not just because of vascular effects, if not also directly to brain inflammation. And she did a lot of studies. She wanted to also to go through MRIs, and then she also tried to do studies in cerebrospinal fluid of children, and she went to several children autopsies, and also did the stains of these brains and get the same findings. After that, there have been several labs in the world trying to reproduce these effects. And today, we already have a theory how PM can produce disruption in the brain transmission, so the neurotransmission can be affected. So there are several labs working in the world that have produced evidences at the different levels of these theories. So one of the theories is that these particles, these ultrafine particles, fine and ultrafine, get through the lungs, and they produce an inflammation through the lungs, and are the cytokines that are able to cross the blood-brain barrier, and then there is a stimulation of these astrocytes, and actually the main driver is the microglia, that you know that is immunological cell that prevents the brain about the external insults, but here what happens is that it's a chronic low-level exposure, and this results in a neurotoxicity. So there are several labs that have shown not only that the blood-brain barrier can be broken, if not also how microglia is affected and how this is affecting the neurotransmission. and dopamine is a big player here. Another story, also shown by other labs, and this is replicated by several labs, is that are the actual particles that get into the brain, cross the blood-brain barrier, and stimulate the microglia. And then there are other studies in animals that shows that ultrafine particles can directly get the brain through the olfactory bulb. And then they are producing also the same response. So we have now a theory based on animal studies, and we started to have human data. And you know this story that is very popular today in the States, where they are very worried about autism because it has grown dramatically from 1/10,000 to 1/2 per 100. And they have several case control studies, at that time 4 in the States and 1 in Taiwan, comparing children with autism and controls from the same population. And they linked being a case with exposure. In some cases, this is the prenatal exposure to air pollution, traffic-related air pollution, and in other cases, the prenatal and postnatal exposure. Well, so this is mostly accepted, but in Europe, we, together with the Dutch group, did a study in birth cohorts. So this is a longitudinal study. We measured air pollution during pregnancy, and then in these children from the general population at different ages per each cohort, 10, 6, 4, with different instruments, we measured the autism spectrum disorder. And what happened is in no one of the cohorts, and we have the Dutch cohort here, Generation R, with a lot of children, and these are our cohorts in Sabadell, for instance. In no one of these cohorts we didn't see any association between the air pollution and the autism spectrum disorder. And if any, it was in the negative range, so it was protective. And these are longitudinal studies, these are not case control, this is Europe, it's not the States, neither Taiwan. We don't think this is because the instruments that are using, because we use different instruments in each cohort, neither the cutoff that we use to define what is a child with autism, because we use different criteria, and in all the cohorts we didn't find any effect. So perhaps it's because there are differences in how we are measuring their pollution. You know that autism is strongly related with paternal age, because there are more chances to have new mutation, rare variants, and perhaps air pollution is playing a role in these mutations. And perhaps we are measuring very well the maternal air pollution and not the paternal air pollution. And this is live in our epidemiological studies, that we are trying to reconstruct the exposures in real life. This is not lab that we expose the rats. But using the same cohorts in several of our birth cohorts in Europe, we did another study. So we measured residential prenatal life with geographical systems. So for each mother, we knew their levels of pollution, and we followed the children, and we measured psychomotor development. And in that case, although a small effect, we were able to find within the same cohorts and using the same methodology, we were able to find that prenatal exposure to air pollution in cities like Sabadell is related to a smaller psychomotor development. So there is still a lot of controversy in the human studies about the potential effects of air pollution in the brain development. And these are the precedents of the study that we did here in Barcelona called BREATH, that we wanted to assess the brain development in school children. And we were focused on ultrafine particles because we wanted to assess exactly if traffic pollution, because most of the studies in the animals were carried out with diesel particles, is actually related with brain development, improving the exposure assessment, and also trying to do valid assessment of the neurodevelopment. So why we did this study in primary school children and not early in life, where the brain develops faster? Well, first, because the school settings are perfect to do direct measurements of air pollution. And second, because as shown here, that this is a study, it's one of the first studies that did repeated measurements of cognitive function, in that case working memory in the same children, and was able to draw a trajectory per each child, showed that also in school age periods there are several cognitive functions that are growing, and we could assess several cognitive functions in school children. And schools are a good setting to do valid and repeated assessment of this. And in epidemiological studies, we love objective tools. So we like a lot the computer test, because there is no observer bias, and this is objective measurements that we can measure in milliseconds the answers. And well, primary school, as I said, is still a vulnerable period, and children in schools have higher exposure. So we know that the schools are settled in places with higher air pollution, and children exercise more during school time, so have also higher exposure. So this is why we decided to do these studies in school children. And what we did is we knew the levels of pollution in Barcelona, and we selected schools stratified by level. So we match schools in high level and low level. So we take pairs of schools and we match the schools by social context. In Barcelona, there is a special case that schools with higher pollution are in the wealthy area. So it's not true that low social classes have higher air pollution. In any case, it's the opposite. So we set 5 monitoring stations full of devices to measure the air pollution, and we set one in the courtyard and another one in the classroom in each pair of schools, and then in a school that, and in a 5th station, sorry, that round this every day, because we measured the schools during 2 weeks, one in the warm and one in the cold season, and we wanted to adjust for the seasonal variation. So at the end, we did this study during the whole 2012. Something that is interesting in terms of exposure, not in terms of neuropsychology, is that if we compare the levels in the classroom and in the courtyard for this particle, this is a carbon particle of 0.7 micrometers, so like a virus that is covered by polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons and metals, we see that the levels in the courtyard and in the classroom in the 2 seasons are exactly the same, and there are no sources indoor. So these children spend their 8 hours in the school breathing the same than if they were in the courtyard. And this is Barcelona 2012. So high exposure during a lot of time, perfect, and huge variability within the city, perfect for the study, not for the children. And then we did this neuropsychological study. So we asked to all the families of the children from 2nd to 4th grade, so these ages, if they want to give the permission to participate, and we get the consent by 60%. So these are the number of children that we tested. And what we did is we wanted to assess trajectories. So we did a repeat every 3 months. I understand that there is orthodoxy here that says, oh, you could not repeat this because there is a learning effect. But we are convinced that with this test, there is very few learning effect. And we have, since we have repeat measure, we could study this at different ages. We could study this because these are complex and these are boring tests, and we measure in in milliseconds. So at the end, we get all these tests, 11,000 tests in a year. And this is because we did this in schools, and we tested the children at the same time with an observer per every 3-4 children. So in an hour, we can test 13 children, 12, 14 children. And we record every accident, everything that happened, but with these ear protectors, and we think that there is not contamination among the children, and that these are very well performed. So what we did, we wanted to measure working memory, and we measured complicated things like 3 and back. You understand very well what this is, but also 2 back, and we did with numbers and letters and colors, and at the end, numbers perform exactly, almost exactly that words, and we measure accuracy that we like a lot because has a perfect statistical properties. It's a normal distribution, it's continuous, every child gives a beautiful number, and it's also a balance between the false alarm and the perfect hit. So we have very nice tools from this. Also we have heat reaction time, all the things that you know. And then we practice also ANT for 10 minutes. So in addition, we can measure like the heat reaction time standard error, to what extent this speed in answering, correct answers, it's constant, or there is, at the end of the test, these children that have more attention problems have larger variance in this. So we have beautiful tools to assess this in these epidemiological studies. And we love these tools because we don't want to diagnose the children. We want to know if the children from schools with higher pollution perform worse or better in these cognitive functions. So, yeah, children grow. This is an example with different stimulus. Around 15 to 20% of their growth happen in a year. And this is what we find. So we found that the trajectories for the whole children in the high air pollution schools are smaller, so this trajectory grows less than in children that came from schools with higher air pollution. In that case, this is probably a 2 and back from numbers, I don't know exactly which is. So at the beginning, the differences were not very good. Probably this was selection of the children, and also because at least the young children at 7 age, there were not big differences. But at the end, the working memory difference between the 2 types of schools increased. And this was adjusted for contextual and individual covariates that are related with working memory. Paternal and maternal education, paternal and maternal occupation, the vulnerability index of the children. And this is the same, but not comparing high and low schools, but if not taking into account the exposure per each one of the schools. This is elemental carbon that is emitted by diesel cars. This is the range, and each dot is a school. So these are the crude values of the school, and it's the growth, in that case, in working memory in a year. So there are schools that the average growth is 30. So this is the deviance, the accuracy of the test, the working test, times 10. So, and schools that is less. And you see that at the same level of air pollution, there is a huge range among the different schools because there are many factors related with working memory, like the quality of the teachers or the education of the family. But when we adjust for this, and this came from the mathematical model, we still see a significant difference, negative difference, higher levels of air pollution, lower growth in cognitive function. One issue that is very important is to understand if this change, a difference at the end in 8, 9 points in this measure, is clinically relevant or not. We always refer to what happened with lead, that the lead was banned from the gasoline because the difference was in 5, 6 points in IQ. And of course, at individual level, 5, 6 points of IQ has no relevance. But at population level, it has a very big impact. Well, what we did is to compare this difference by air pollution with the difference by months of growth, of age. And this difference is comparable, so per inch interquartile range in increase in air pollution is similar to a difference of 40 days. So this is not very important. But we know that working memory is behind learning and many other psychiatric problems. So this is something that we also did. So the parents fill in the SDQ, the strengths and difficulties questionnaires, and the teacher fill in the corners. And this was done only once, so this is cross-sectional association. It's not longitudinal as before. So we could not know the reverse causality here, what's first. But it was significant that for elemental carbon in the classroom, elemental carbon out in the courtyard, and this is noise also that we measure, but for elemental carbon, for SDQ, for the different domains, emotion, conduct, hyperactivity, peering, and prosocial, we saw that for an interquartile increase, there is an increase in these domains. So children with higher pollution, their parents report more behavioral problems. Interestingly, that we don't see anything with hyperactivity and attention, but we saw this for noise. Very interesting. While noise is not affecting the behavior, at least except prosocial. Well, this is cross-sectional, so weaker than before. But probably the impact of these findings is stronger than we thought. Then is another concern, if this is temporal, and there will be a catch-up, of this will stay permanently to these generations. And what we have done is repeat this assessment in 2015. And the children that were younger, we still see the effect. But we cannot differentiate if this is because of the exposure at 2012 or that this exposure remained in 2013 and 14 and 15, and still these children were exposed. But 3 years afterwards, for this generation that stay in the schools, we still find the effects. So this can have a profound impact in these generations. Well, in addition, in 300 children, we invite them to Hospital del Mar, and with Jesus Pujol, we also did an MRI. And we didn't find differences in the volumes, not in DTI, but we found, and this was published in Neuroimaging this year, we found an effect in the functional MRI. So for 10 seconds, they were resting in the tube, and then they started to listen the Pastoral of Beethoven, and they watched for 10-second images, faces. So they were resting here, and started to hear, and started to view. So there is a deactivation, and we record every second during these 10 seconds, the images, and we can see this transition from resting, so deactivation, activation of the brain. And what happened is that children from schools with high pollution and children from schools in low pollution do this process in a different way. And the children from higher schools do it in a slower way. And the interpretation that we did is that the integration of the different pathways in the brain is functionally affected. So there is like these brains are laser, so they perform in a more slower way than the others. So this is in the vicinity of the brain area, and then it's something in the base so this is the vicinity of the brain area and something in the basal ganglia here. Well, there is a lot of concern, and I'm finishing, there is a lot of concern if air pollution is linked to social class or education or other factors, and actually it's just an indicator. In fact, we did a lot of work to try to adjust for this, and as I said, in Barcelona, if any, the relationship is the opposite. But we did something that we think rid of control at all for the residual confounding by social class. And social class means everything, what you know from your practice. And this is to see if the daily variations in air pollution affect the daily variation in attention and hyperactivity symptoms. So all of you know that these symptoms vary day by day. If they take the pill or not take the pill, if they have sweeteners or not have sweeteners, there are many triggers that change their symptomatology. And here, we were able to measure the air pollution at the day of the exam, the previous day of the exam, and 2 days before of the exam. And we saw that the air pollution at the previous day of the exam increased, in that case, the symptoms of inattentiveness, hit reaction time standard error, by an amount, a considerable amount. And this is adjusted by the level of air pollution at this school. So within the same school, we found that in the children of the same school, we found variation in the relationship according to the air pollution of the day before the test. And this could not be confounded by air pollution, neither by any of the individual variables related with the children, because we are comparing these children along the time, and all the temporal variables can be affecting this. So, and this is accepted, it's going to be published soon. So this is confirming that altogether the picture is quite convincing. I don't know the time. 5 minutes still? Okay. So I have time to finish my presentation. Something that we discovered, and this is interesting, is that the schools are a factory of PM2.5. I explained what is PM2.5 already, because the indoor levels are higher than outdoor levels. And here you can see, this is our reference station. This is in the courtyard, and this is in the classroom. And what we did is, in our filters, we measure all the elements, the chemical elements, the 33 elements. So then, applying PCI factor analysis, we can classify the origin of the PM2.5. And in our reference station, most of the particles are secondary or traffic, originally directed by traffic or road dash. All this is traffic, okay. But in the courtyard, we see other sources that this is mineral. So there are this yard with dust, and these particles are very fragile and became very small. And then there is a lot of organic material. So these children have things in their body, their skin, the textiles, and there is something in the schools that are also particles. And we know that the legal level of PM2.5 is 25 in Europe, in the States is 12, and the WHO recommend 10. So the schools are highly polluted of PM2.5. And we were interested to understand if the different sources of PM2.5 also affect brain development. And what we did find, and this was published recently, and what we did find, and among the sources, only the particles that came from traffic are related with neurodevelopment. So it's something in this cell that is affecting it's not just the size of the particle. Perhaps it's because traffic has more ultrafines, but perhaps it's something in that could be the PAHs, the hydrocarbons, or some of the metals that are affecting this. And finally, another discovery from this study is that the environment comes in a package. So air pollution comes along with noise, along with green spaces. And believe or not, every day there are satellites above us that can measure kilometer per kilometer many variables. And if you go to the NASA, you can retrieve the satellite data. All over the world, every day, satellites above us. So we know the exact vegetation that is in each school, the number of trees. And what we saw in the school and behind the school, so what we found, it was that, and this was published in PNAS, that the children from schools with low greenness, so low vegetation, low chlorophylla, because the satellite identified the chlorophylla, the development of the brain was lower than the schools with more vegetation. And 60 to 70% of this effect is mediated by air pollution. There is 30 to 40% that we don't know why. The psychologists love this psychological theory of the greenness, that it's very good, especially for anxiety, and there are all these theories. But exactly we don't know if this is true. Mainly it's air pollution and other effects of greening. I have a theory that this can affect microbiota, and microbiota is affecting brain, but this is also unknown. So, the conclusions are that prenatal exposure to air pollution affects reproductive life, and that children from schools with higher traffic air pollutants had a smaller growth in cognitive development over time, that functional MRI suggests a general functional immaturity of the brain of the children more exposed to air pollution, and perhaps greening cities, at least greening schools, could be a strategy to reduce air pollution health effects. Thank you very much.